So videoscopes can look completely alien when you're new to color grading. However, they hold the key to perfect exposure, color balance, and professional level skin tones. It's super important that you understand how to read your scopes. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to read them, when to use certain scopes at each stage of your workflow, and finally, I'll reveal the one mistake that all beginners make when using scopes, how to avoid it, and level up your workflow. Hey guys, JMO here. Welcome back to another tutorial. Let's get into it. Cool, so let's just pull up our color page here. And first thing is all our scopes are located down to the bottom right here. And at all times, we'll have one scope showing in the bottom right. If we want to change between the scope that's viewing, we just have this drop down menu here, and we can quickly change that to like our Vectorscope, Waveform, up to the parade. So we can easily flick between our scope options. Now, if we want to view more than one scope at once, we've got this pop-out menu, and we have one scope, two scope, four scope. So for example, if I want to have four scopes showing, I can do this, and we have, four scopes on top of each other. Then I can go in here, I can select the vector scope. Maybe I want to change this to waveform, parade, waveform, Vectorscope, histogram. So you can then, if you've got a second monitor, you can easily have, more than one scope showing. So if I go up to the top right here, I've got waveform scale style. I've got 10-bit, 12-bit, percentage, millivolts, and HDR. So I generally keep it on 10-bit, and from 10-bit, we've got 0 to 1023. Next in the waveform scale style, we've got video level scopes and data level scopes. The difference between these is video level scopes, if you're color grading for broadcast, like TV broadcast, you'll want to use video level scopes. If you're not color grading for TV broadcast, and if you're posting on the web or social media, you can select data level scopes. Okay, so let's pull up our waveform here. And if we have a look at our image here, we've got our subject off to the center right, and then we've got the sky at the back and the ocean at the back. Now, going from left to right on our image, on our frame, it's the same on the waveform scope. So if I take my mouse and just go across, you can see the qualifier moving across as I move across the image. On the left-hand side, we've got the 0 to 1023. This represents our luminance values. Anything, say, between 0 and 384, that would represent our shadow region. And then anything between 384 to 768, that's going to represent our mids, our mid-tone region. And then anything above 768, you're starting to get into your highlights and your brighter regions. If I hover over the ocean here, I can see that they're sitting between 384 and 512. So that'll be in our mid-tone region. If I go to the skin tones here, I can see they're a bit higher. They're between 640 and 768. Then if I go to the hair here, it's a bit darker. That's represented on the lower end of our waveform. You can see we're down towards 128. So that's how we read the waveform. That's how we're seeing the luminance values of our frame. Let's just go through another few examples. So we can see here we've got this nice silhouette shot, and we're backlit with the sun. So obviously the sun's very bright, and it's giving off a very high luminance number, which is represented here on the waveform. Then if I go to the subject and the shadow region, you can see we're starting to drop down to 256, 384. So with our waveform, we can actually colorize it or turn that on or off. Generally, because when you're using a waveform, you're working with luminance values only. You'd want to turn off the colorize, but you've got that option if you want to turn it on. Now, if I drop down the menu here, and you can see here I've got waveform. If I pull that to the left, you can see it's disappearing. If I pull that to the right, it's showing more detail. Then I've got the graticule. So if I pull that to the left, the bars are disappearing, and then the numbers disappear. Pull it to the right, they get more vivid. So generally, I like to keep it sort of in there for the graticule, and then the waveform, we can just bring it down slightly. Below that, we've got show reference levels. Now, if I select that and start to pull up, you can see we're getting a line here going up. As I lift it up, it's the reference levels going up and up and up. And then if I take the high reference level and pull it down, you can see we've got this line going down. So this is useful when we're in the video level scopes, and when you're using the scopes in video level scopes, you'll want to set your reference levels, your low reference levels to 64, and then your high to 940. That's because here in 940 and here at 64 in the video level scopes, this is where we actually start to clip our highlights and then crush our blacks here. So we'll start losing data below this line and we'll start losing data above this line. So if you are color grading and using the video level scopes, you'll want to put in your reference lines here. If I press and hold the option button and then take my middle mouse wheel and start to scroll, I can actually zoom in and get a bit more of a detailed look at the waveform. Now what you'll notice is the signal on this one, it's quite noisy, and you can see it's like quite muffled, quite noisy, and it's not crisp. What I can actually do is if I go to these three buttons here, three dots, and select low pass filter, now you see we've cleaned up all that noise and we've got a much cleaner signal on our waveform. So I'll just show you before and then I'll show you after. Now, one thing you might have noticed is when I select low pass filter, if you have a look at these little spikes here in the highlights, if I press that, that all disappears and all that noise is cleaned up. What that means is we do actually have parts of our image that sit up here, but because we've used that low pass filter and cleaned up the noise signal, we're losing that. So when you do use the low pass filter, you'll want to make sure you select extents here. And then now you see we get the extents. So you can see the full range of our luminance values now. So you can see all this has reappeared. And it just keeps you safe, you know, whenever you're pushing up your highlights or bringing on your shadows, you'll be able to see the regions that you'll lose with that extents option selected. If I just zoom in here and I have a quick look, and let's say I take off the low pass filter, you can see we're kind of going up into those extents, and then they turn on, they disappear. But because we've got our extents on, we can see the full range. So that's just something to keep in mind when you are cleaning up your signal using that low pass filter. Now, another option here is the display qualifier focus. So if that's off and I hover over the frame here with my qualifier, you'll see I'm hovering over, but I'm not getting anything on the scopes. It's just staying as it is. So when I select display qualifier focus, I'll now get this ring appear on the scope. And as I move around the image, I can see exactly the part of the scope that's related to the part of the image that I'm hovering over. So you'll want to keep this on because when you're doing things like your white balance or you're checking certain areas or certain luminance values, you'll want to know exactly where you're sitting. With the waveform, one thing I see with beginners who are starting out to color grade and they've taken their image in, converted it, S-log, and we're in our DaVinci wide gamut space here. So, they'll start to come in, start to lift the gain, bring that right up to the top, and then start bringing down the lift and really trying to maximize the range of the waveform. Now, that's fine, but you don't always need to push your highlights right up to 1023, and you don't always need to push your shadows right down to 0. So I see a lot of beginners come in and really try and stretch out that tonal range when, for example, a shot like this, it's quite evenly lit and we don't have a super high contrast scene. So we don't have any areas in our shot where it really needs to be sitting at that really high end of the luminance values. So if I just reset that and reset that, if I lift up the gain here and say, let's put it to about there, our sky is pretty bright, our skin tones are well exposed, and we need to bring down our shadows a little bit to get some contrast. And let's say about there. So to me, that's looking pretty good. And we haven't stretched the image at the higher end. If anything, we could, if we want to have it more moody or less exposed, we could actually bring that down, and we're still getting nicely exposed skin tones around that 640 mark, and we're getting a bit darker on the ocean and the sky. We've got our RGB scopes here. What the RGB scopes are showing is the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel, how strong the signal is for each of those channels. So If we take a shot like this, where we've got some whites, we've got some blue at the swimming pool, and now just looking at this image, we can see that it looks pretty good. It looks balanced. It looks correct. So when we're looking at an image, keep in mind that our eyes can trick us. So we could be looking at something and think that looks pretty good, but in reality, there could be a hue shift. There could be a red shift, a blue shift, a green shift. So in order for us to check that, what we can do is we can go down to our dropper here, qualifier, and if I just right click and you see here, show picker RGB value. So now when I hover over any pixel on the image, we'll get a reading for our red, green, and blue channel. And you can see if you look at our RGB parade scope here, we're getting a circle for the red value, the green value, and the blue value. And then if I look at my scope, if I look at my dropper on the image, we've got red 95, green 136, and blue 133. And that's being represented on the scopes. Now, if we go to a neutral color, let's go to our whites here, and we can see we've got a pretty even value between our red, green, and blue. So we've got 204 for red, 204 for green, and we've got 204 for blue. So we've actually got it exact there. So we've got exact readings on our red, green, and blue, which essentially means it's going to be white or neutral or black, depending on the luminance. So here it's a brighter luminance value, so it's going to show as a white. And if I look at the RGB parade, the three circles are all lining up nicely. Basically what it's saying is this image is correctly balanced. It's correctly white balanced. We don't have any color shift in the neutral tone. If I just go forward, now it's the same scene, but you can see we've got a color shift here. So straight up, if I just take a glance at the scopes here on the right side, I can see that the red is lifting up much higher than the green, and the green's lifting up much higher than the blue. So we're pushed towards red and green. And when I look at the image, when I look at the scene, this is reflected by a shift to yellow. So red and green makes yellow. The red and green's higher than the blue. We can see a yellow color cast across the scene. And if I just take my dropper here and go to those white areas that we were on before, we can see we've got red 217, green 208, and blue 192. Straight up, we can see we've got a bit of a shift towards red and green. So that's confirmed in our scopes and then confirmed with the picker value here. When you're adjusting your white balance, that's the first thing you'll want to look at. You'll want to look at your RGB and you'll want to see where they're sitting. Now, because red and green's higher, if I go to my gain here, gain reflects the highlights and the brights, which is going to be reflected in our whites here. If I start to pull down those reds, you can see the scope starting to balance up. Then I'll pull down the greens and then I'll push up the blues. So I'm just looking at the scope here. I'm not even really looking at the image, but I'm just trying to level them out. And then if I look back at the image here and take the dropper, now I can see we're getting more balanced. We're still red and green heavy, but we can actually pull down a little bit more red, pull a little bit more green, push up a bit more blue, and then let's go back, pull out a little bit more red. So now we're getting pretty close. And if I go back and forth between those two images, you can see we have actually white balanced that shot. And if I look at the scopes, as I flick between both, you can see that the RGB values are lined up. Using the RGB parade is a really great way to correct your white balance, correct any color casts on your image. So one thing I do see beginners doing with the RGB, now, whenever you're looking at your RGB parade here and you're trying to, let's say you're trying to white balance a shot, depending on the scene that you're working on, let's take this one here, for example, right? So we've got more green and less blue, and it's a warm sunset shot. Naturally in this scene, we're going to have a push towards the red and the green channels and less so on the blue channels. Now, if I start to balance this up, so say I'm looking at my RGB and I'm thinking if I'm taking this image and I'm thinking there's an imbalance here with the RGB, then let's say I start to move the blue, let's say I start pulling that up, then start lifting the blues there, get them lined up, push the greens down. And now you can see I'm starting to balance everything up a little bit better as according to the RGB parade. Now, if I go before and after, the shot looks completely ruined when I've tried to balance it based on the RGB. So in this case, it looks better in the image on the scene to have an imbalance in the RGB. That's because we're looking at something that's green at sunset. We should expect warmer tones and more green tones. You don't always need to have these perfectly lined up when you're trying to white balance a shot. So unlike our waveform and our RGB, which is showing us luminance values and brightness intensities and shadows, our Vectorscope is going to be really useful for saturation and hue. So when we want to see certain colors, when we want to see saturation intensity, we'll use our Vectorscope. So if I just take the Vectorscope here, and so in our Vectorscope menu, we've got standard, simplified, and hue vectors. So I mostly use standard. Simplified just takes off that circle, minimizes the Vectorscope, keeps it really minimal. And if you just don't want to be distracted, you just want to focus in on your hues and your saturation values, you can change it to simplified. Then we've got hue vectors, which really just focuses in on the hue. And it's a slightly different style of Vectorscope. The one thing I did notice about this was if I take my qualifier, it doesn't actually show it on the Vectorscope when I'm moving around the different hues. So even if I have the display qualifier focus on, whereas if I put that back to standard, you can see we've got the qualifier focus. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you do change the hue vectors and saturation. So that's the three styles of Vectorscope that we've got. So I like to keep it on standard. Now, what's going on here with the Vectorscope? So we've got these little boxes for red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. We've got our primaries and our secondary colors. And then we've got this crosshair, and then we've got this center point, and then we've got this circle, this 360 degrees. Let me just walk you through it, get you familiar with the Vectorscope. So first thing is, let's look at our color. So we've got red here. We've got two boxes for red. What are these two boxes for red? Well, if I go to this Vectorscope and press 75% target, you can see that other box disappeared. And now we're showing a 75% target for red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. These are 75% saturation levels for each of the hues, each of the main color hues. Then if I go to 100% target, the boxes move out, and now we've got 100% target ranges for the same colors. And then finally, we've got 75 and 100. So you've got our 75% target and our 100% target for each of the hues. Now, why do you need 75% and why do you need 100%? Well, if you're color grading for broadcast on, let's say, TV or traditional broadcasting, the 75% target is your safe, broadcast safe zone. Anything outside that, it's not going to display correctly and there may be issues. If you're color grading for web or online or social media, you can actually afford to push them out a bit more. So you can go out to the 100% here. Let's take a look at our scene and see what's actually going on from a color perspective. You can see if I look at this image here, we've got orange, we've got yellows around the sun, some whites in the ocean, and then we've got some blues here. Now, because the Vectorscope is representing hue and saturation, if I pull up my saturator here in the DCTL that I use, if I start to pull this saturation down, you're going to see the hue and the colors shrink on the Vectorscope. And then if I look to the image, you can see the colors also reducing, the saturation's reducing. Now, if I pull this up to the right, you'll see that I'm pushing the saturation higher and the image is getting more saturated, and the Vectorscope, we're pushing way out up to those 75, 100% levels on the oranges there, which you can see here, it's super saturated, right? It's like kind of too much on the image. So by knowing where you want your image to sit from a saturation level, you can then use your Vectorscope to get consistency across different images. Like let's say, for example, you've got 5 or 6 different shots that you're trying to match up, and you want them all matched from a saturation level. If I go through each of those shots and then glance at my Vectorscope and see, where the color is pushed out to on the circle, then I can line them all up. I can start matching them and adjusting saturation levels so they all line up here. and all our saturations are matched. So the next thing our Vectorscope tells us is also the hue. So if I go down to this this hue slider here and start to pull it left, you can see the Vectorscope is starting to push to the yellow. You can see that bending here towards yellow. And then if I look at the image, you can see that the image is getting much more yellow in the sky, and that's getting represented on the Vectorscope. Now, if I push to the right, you can see we're pushing out to red. Now we're getting a red sky. If I push even further, it's going to start turning magenta, and you can see that in the image. Now, obviously you wouldn't do that, but I'm just showing you for a visual reference. That's how our hue and our saturation is represented on the Vectorscope. So we've got this color gradient on our scene, and you can see if I take the qualifier and I start to go around, you can see here we're touching that 100% red, then we're going down, we got our 75% red here, and then as I move around this image, you can see exactly where our colors lie. So obviously as we go towards the middle, we're getting less saturated. And as I move out to the edges, we're getting more saturated. And you can see how that looks on the Vectorscope. So let's just take this saturation level of orange. And you can see we're sitting in at around, let's say 70% saturation. As I drop it, we're getting less and less saturated, right until we get to the center. Because our Vectorscope displays hue and saturation levels, anything that's white, gray, black, anything without a hue will basically sit directly in the center of the Vectorscope. If I hover over anything white, black, gray, even this gray scale, you can see our qualifier is sitting as an exact circle in the center. Whereas if I jump to a color, you can see it jumping between the saturation targets there. And then one last thing with our Vectorscope, if I go to here and show skin tone indicator, this line is our skin tone line. So all skin tones will sit on roughly on this line, no matter your ethnicity. So it's a really great guide to make sure that when you are color grading and you are editing with a talent or an individual, a model, that you want to make sure that you do get your skin tones close to that line. Now, there are times when they won't necessarily sit on the line exactly, but it is good to just be aware of where your skin tones are. And if you do make a creative decision to push them off that line, just know that it can mean that when someone's watching it, it might look unnatural or it might look a little bit off. So, but there are cases where it can work. So now let me just show you. So we've got our skin tone line and we've got our vector here. So let me just zoom it in a little bit. Now, if I go to this button and then press low, mid, or high, so we know skin tones sit around that mid region. So if I'll just turn on the mid, and I can kind of see here, if I start to hover over, you can see that the skin tones are actually sitting off to the left of that skin tone line, meaning they're more pushed to the yellow hue. So if I was working on this image and color grading it, I would definitely want to correct that and shift those skin tones back to red. So what I would do is there's a few ways you can do it, but I could adjust the white balance of the shot. I can come down here to the hue, and let's just say if I want to move those back in line, you can see as I move that hue, I can push them just to the right. Now keep in mind when you do shift anything on that hue slider, all hues in your scene will start to shift. So if there are some hues in the scene that you don't really want to shift, you may not want to use this option, but for this example, it's okay. We've got these blues in the back. I don't mind them going a little bit more cyan as I push the skin tones back to red. So now we can see that the skin tones are starting to look more natural. And if I just do before and after, you can see that we've pushed those yellow skin tones back towards red here, and we're sitting more nicely on this skin tone indicator. And another little trick is we can just pull a key on the face here. If I just pull a key on her face, and I can do a mask. And now if I look at this Vectorscope, I can see that those skin tones are sitting perfectly on that skin tone line. So if I put them to the left, now they're too yellow, now they're too red, and there we're sitting perfect. And generally with skin tones, I like to have them on the line or pushed slightly red. I don't really like having yellowish skin tones because it'll just mean someone looks like they're an alien or they've got jaundice. So you don't want to be sitting there. You want to be sitting a bit more pink or on that line. So another thing we've got with the Vectorscope here, we can show 2x zoom. Now if I press that, it's gonna double the visible colors here, and we can see in a bit more detail where we're pushed in terms of the hue. Now the only problem with that is if I do have this turned on, it's going to push out and you're going to see that it's going to look like we're out at these 75% values, where in reality we're sitting about here. So just keep that in mind if you do turn that on, that it's going to look like we're more saturated than we are. So I've got a mask around that swimming pool. If I just take the saturation on the mask and start to push it, you can see what's happening here on that cyan on the vector. It's starting to push away out because I'm increasing that saturation. And then if I take it down, you can watch the image starting to get more desaturated to the point where there's no saturation now. Well, there's very minimal saturation in that swimming pool. And then finally, we've got our quality here. So our scopes do use our GPU. So if you're running on a slower machine and you've got your scopes on high, you might see things slowing down a little bit. But generally, if you've got a decent machine, you can just keep them on high, you get better quality. If you put on auto, it'll just match the quality to how good your GPU is. And if you've got the processing power, it'll display them in high. We've got our histogram. To be honest, I barely use the histogram. It shows, so the histogram shows your luminance values from left to right. So on the left side, you have your shadows. On your right side, you've got your highlights. And then as you move along those luminance values, you'll get pixel count or pixel density at that luminance value. So to be honest, I use the waveform and the RGB parade to get my luminance and color cast. If you're really needing to use a histogram, it's there. Feel free to jump in and have a look. And then we've got finally our CIE, Chromaticity. So what's this all about? Well, first time I saw this, it just looks completely alien. I've never really seen anything like it before. And it did take a while to sort of get my head around. Once you start to understand what's going on, then it makes sense. I don't have a massive need to use this one, but it is useful just to understand what it is and what it does. So let me walk you through it. So you've got this horseshoe here, and this is basically an area of all visible colors. Okay, so that's where all visible colors live. Rec 709 is what we view most devices and TV on. So whenever we export to Rec 709, this is where all the colors will live inside this triangle. What it's saying is that Rec 709 is quite a compressed color gamut versus if I pull up DaVinci wide gamut, you can see we've got this huge color gamut, this huge color space. So whenever we bring our S-Log footage or our log footage into DaVinci wide gamut, we're now all of a sudden working within this large color space, meaning we've got more dynamic range, more color options, and more creative control over our edit. So that's why we have this workflow set up. And then when we export it out to Rec 709, we'll take all that data and we'll compress it down into this smaller triangle here so it can be viewed on devices, on web, on TV. So we've got this here, this point, this is our white point. So you can see if I go to Rec 709 D65, our white point is sitting at 6,500 Kelvin. So that's there. Now, you don't necessarily need to change your white point, but if I want to change my white point, I'll go to chromatic adaptation, drop that on. Then if I go here, and I can actually move my white point. So I can change it to D60, D50, D55. I would take the time to dive in and understand this one because it is quite interesting, and it'll just give you a deeper rounded knowledge of the rest of the color grading workflow and process whenever you do sort of dive into this. If you have a look at our color dispersion here from this scene, if I start to see, say for example, these blues push out to this edge of the Rec 709 triangle, it's basically just going to mean I'm going to run into trouble whenever it's playing back on a screen because you've pushed outside the actual color gamut. So just one thing to keep in mind, if you do want to export, just make sure you're not pushing outside this triangle here for Rec 709. Cool, so that's all the graphs. So we've got those 5 different graphs in DaVinci. The main ones I'd say are your RGB parade, your waveform, and your Vectorscope. So if you get those 3 down and start to understand exactly what's happening with those 3 scopes, you'll be able to dial in exposure. You'll be able to correct any color shifts or hue shifts or imbalances in your shots. And then also you'll be able to dial in your skin tones. If you've got any questions, please feel free to leave some comments. And as always, there are free downloads linked in the description below. So go ahead and download your free color grading cheat sheets. I've got an exposure mini course there as well, which is free. I've got some free LUTs for download. So go ahead, download everything you need. All the tools, all the PDFs, all the documents are there to help you on your color grading journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you did watch it all the way through to the end. It really helps the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.